Once hailed as the queen of the baby groupies, Sable Starr was one of the most infamous figures in the rock and roll scene of the 1970s. Born into a wealthy family in Palos Verdes, she didn't follow the conventional path expected of an upper-class girl. Instead, she dove headfirst into a world of rebellion, fame, and controversy. As a teenager, she became a fixture in Los Angeles' hottest nightclubs, where the biggest rock stars of the era gathered. But behind the glamorous facade was a much darker reality, a life entangled with power, temptation, and sacrifice. Sable Starr, born Sabelle Hayes Shields on August 15, 1957, in Florida, USA, grew up in a wealthy family in Palos Verdes, California. From an early age, she exhibited a rebellious personality and was drawn to the energetic and often controversial rock and roll lifestyle. By the age of 11, she had already begun attending concerts with older friends, fully immersing herself in the thriving rock scene of the late 1960s and early 1970s. Sable Starr, born Sable Hayes Shields on August 15, 1957, in Palos Verdes, California, was raised in an affluent and relatively stable household. Palos Verdes, a coastal city known for its wealthy residents and scenic beauty, provided Starr with a privileged upbringing. She grew up surrounded by comfort, but despite her advantageous circumstances, she was drawn to a lifestyle that stood in stark contrast to the expectations of her family and community. From a young age, Starr displayed a rebellious nature, often resisting the traditional norms expected of a girl from an upper-middle-class background. While many children from similar households followed a structured path, focusing on academics, extracurricular activities, and preparing for college, Starr sought excitement and independence elsewhere. She gravitated toward older crowds, particularly those involved in the rock and roll scene, where she found a sense of belonging that was absent in her structured suburban life. By the age of 11, she had already begun sneaking out to attend concerts with friends who were older than her, many of whom had already dropped out of school. This marked her first real exposure to the rock world, which at the time was booming in Los Angeles. The late 1960s and early 1970s saw an explosion of rock culture, with venues like the Whiskey A Go-Go and the Troubadour becoming central hubs for musicians and fans alike. Starr quickly became enamored with the energy and recklessness of this world, which offered a thrilling escape from the predictability of her privileged upbringing. Despite her increasingly unconventional lifestyle, Starr continued to live at home and attended Palos Verdes High School, one of the more prestigious schools in the area. Her parents, though likely aware of her growing interest in rock music, allowed her to continue her education in the hope that she would eventually follow a more conventional path. However, Starr was leading a double life. While she may have sat in classrooms during the day, by night she was a fixture in the Los Angeles music scene, frequenting clubs and rubbing shoulders with some of the biggest rock stars of the era. One of the key places where she spent much of her time was Rodney Bingenheimer's English Disco, a nightclub on Sunset Boulevard that catered specifically to teenagers who idolized glam rock musicians. Unlike many other clubs in the area, English Disco welcomed underage girls, making it a breeding ground for the baby groupie subculture. Starr quickly became one of the most recognized faces in this scene, not just as a fan, but as an influential figure among young groupies who sought relationships with famous rock musicians. Starr had a younger sister named Coral Shields, who would later follow in her footsteps. Coral also became involved in the rock scene and in 1973 had a relationship with Iggy Pop, one of the most influential punk musicians of the time. Iggy Pop would later reference Starr and her sister in his music, notably in the song Look Away, where he reflects on the underage groupie culture of the 1970s with a tone of regret. The presence of both sisters in the groupie scene raises questions about their upbringing. It is unclear whether they came from a permissive household that encouraged such behavior or whether they were simply drawn to the lifestyle despite their parents' attempts to intervene. Some groupies of the era came from troubled or neglectful homes, seeking validation and excitement from rock stars. However, there is no substantial evidence to suggest that Starr came from a broken family. If anything, she seemed to have had access to stability and privilege, but chose to reject it in favor of a more rebellious path. By her early teens, Starr was no longer just attending concerts. She was forming personal relationships with some of the biggest names in rock. She became romantically involved with David Bowie, Mick Jagger, Rod Stewart, and Mark Bolan, among others. Unlike most teenage fans who admired musicians from afar, Starr had direct access to them, often spending time backstage or even traveling with them. Her striking appearance, confidence, and ability to navigate the adult world of rock musicians made her stand out among the many young girls who idolized rock stars. She quickly gained a reputation as one of the top groupies in the scene, and her name became synonymous with the baby groupie movement. While other girls may have looked up to rock stars, Starr was seen as a celebrity in her own right within the underground world of teenage groupies. Sable Starr's upbringing in an affluent environment did not deter her from seeking thrills in the rock world. Instead, it may have played a role in pushing her toward rebellion. Growing up in a structured and privileged community like Palos Verdes, where expectations were clear-cut and the future seemed predetermined, could have made the unpredictability and chaos of rock and roll even more appealing. The contrast between her stable home life and the wildness of the music industry may have fueled her desire to break away from societal norms. Unlike many rock stars and fellow groupies who came from troubled backgrounds, Starr had the luxury of choice. She wasn't escaping poverty or family dysfunction, but instead running towards something that felt more exciting and free. Sable Starr was among the first and most infamous baby groupies of the early 1970s, a term used to describe teenage girls who immerse themselves in the rock scene, forming close relationships with musicians. Unlike the typical fan who admired rock stars from a distance, Starr was actively involved in their world, making a name for herself in the glam rock scene that dominated Los Angeles. She spent her teenage years frequenting the most iconic clubs of the era, including the Rainbow Bar and Grill, Whiskey A Go-Go, and Rodney Bingenheimer's English Disco, venues that served as the epicenter of the city's thriving rock culture. Her introduction to the scene happened at just 14 years old, when a friend invited her to the Whiskey A Go-Go. This invitation marked the beginning of her transformation from a rebellious suburban teenager into a figure who would become a legend within the underground rock world. Unlike many of her peers, Starr actively sought attention and excitement, embracing the lifestyle with confidence. She later admitted that she had always been drawn to trouble, stating that she was nuts to begin with and loved getting into risky situations. Despite her growing reputation in the rock world, Starr still lived at home with her family in Palos Verdes and attended Palos Verdes High School. She maintained this routine mainly to keep her parents from interfering in her increasingly wild lifestyle. However, she crafted a dual identity. By day, she was a high school student. By night, she was one of the most sought-after and recognizable groupies in Los Angeles. Unlike some of the other girls in the scene, Starr actively worked on shaping her image. She felt insecure about her appearance and, at the age of 15, underwent a nose job to improve what she saw as imperfections. The cosmetic surgery reflected her deep commitment to being noticed and admired within the rock world, where outrageous fashion and striking looks were key. She frequently dressed in glam rock-inspired outfits, often wearing flashy, provocative clothing and heavy makeup, which helped her stand out among the many young girls vying for the attention of famous musicians. By 1973, Starr's status as a top-tier groupie was well established. That year, she gave an interview to Star magazine, a short-lived Los Angeles-based publication, where she boasted about being the best groupie in the scene. She had already formed close relationships with some of the biggest names in rock, including David Bowie, Rod Stewart, and Alice Cooper. Starr claimed that what set her apart from other girls was her boldness and distinctive fashion choices, which caught the attention of musicians wherever she went. At the height of her fame within the underground rock world, she was frequently photographed alongside famous rock stars, with her pictures appearing in well-known music magazines like Cream and Rock Scene. Her confidence and dominance in the groupie scene also led to rivalries with other young women competing for the same musician's attention. Lori Maddox, another prominent baby groupie, later recalled that Starr once threatened her over Jimmy Page, warning her to keep her hands off the Led Zeppelin guitarist and even saying, "If you touch him, I will shoot you. He's mine." This level of possessiveness reflected how deeply Starr and other groupies saw themselves as part of the musicians' inner circles, not just as fans, but as romantic partners, muses, and fixtures of the rock and roll lifestyle. Among her closest friends in Los Angeles were fellow groupies, Shrey Mecum and Queenie, both of whom were also deeply involved in the scene. Model Baby Buell, another well-known figure from the era, later described Starr as one of the two most influential groupies in Los Angeles, saying that every major rock star who visited the city wanted to meet her. At 16, Starr took a drastic step that shifted the trajectory of her life. She ran away from home to be with Johnny Thunders, the guitarist of the New York Dolls. Their relationship was intense, destructive, and marked by heavy drug use and emotional abuse. Unlike her previous relationships with musicians, which had been mostly glamorous and thrilling, her time with Thunders introduced her to the darker side of the rock world. Thunders, already struggling with a severe heroin addiction, was controlling and violently jealous. During their time together, Starr became pregnant with his child, but she ultimately chose to have an abortion rather than marry him. The relationship became increasingly toxic, with Thunders' addiction spiraling out of control and his abusive behavior escalating. Starr later described this period as one of the most damaging times of her life, saying that Thunders tried to destroy her personality and that, after being with him, she just wasn't Sable Starr anymore. Feeling completely broken, she finally left him and returned to Los Angeles, disillusioned and emotionally exhausted. Although she moved back to LA, she continued to visit New York frequently, where she became involved in the city's burgeoning punk scene. She had an affair with Richard Hell, one of punk's most influential figures, and formed a close friendship with Nancy Spungen, who would later become infamous for her turbulent relationship with Sid Vicious of the Sex Pistols. By the mid to late 1970s, Starr was deeply embedded in both the glam rock and punk rock scenes, placing her at the heart of two of the most influential music movements of the decade. However, as the 1980s approached, Starr began to fade from the groupie scene. The punk movement was shifting, and many of the musicians she had once been close to were either struggling with addiction, leaving the industry, or moving on to different phases in their careers. The era of the baby groupies was also coming to an end, as attitudes toward young girls in the rock scene were changing. Starr herself had grown older and no longer fit the image of the wide-eyed teenage girl who had once dominated the Sunset Strip. By the early 1980s, she had quietly stepped away from the groupie lifestyle, leaving behind the world that had defined her teenage years. Sable Starr's rise to fame in the Los Angeles rock scene was not without controversy. As a teenage girl deeply embedded in the adult world of rock and roll, she became a symbol of the wild excesses of the era, but her lifestyle also raised serious ethical concerns. Unlike casual fans, who admired musicians from afar, Starr and her fellow baby groupies were directly involved with some of the biggest names in music, many of whom were significantly older. The relationships between underage girls and adult rock stars were not only normalized at the time, but even glamorized, despite the clear power imbalances and ethical concerns that would later come under scrutiny. Though Starr was highly idolized in the groupie subculture, she was also a polarizing figure, known for her strong personality, possessiveness, and occasional aggression. Rivalries between groupies were common, as many young girls competed for the attention of the same rock stars. Starr, known for her confidence and territorial nature, did not shy away from confrontation. She openly admitted to getting into physical fights with other groupies who she saw as threats to her standing. One of the most notorious incidents involved Lori Maddox, another famous baby groupie, who later claimed that Starr threatened her over Jimmy Page, the legendary guitarist of Led Zeppelin. According to Maddox, Starr told her, "If you touch him, I will shoot you. He's mine." This statement, while extreme, reflected how deeply invested Starr was in the competitive, high-stakes world of rock and roll groupies, where securing the affection of a rock star was seen as a status symbol. While Starr was undoubtedly one of the most well-connected groupies in Los Angeles, her dominance in the scene also made her a divisive figure. Some admired her fearlessness, while others saw her as controlling and aggressive when it came to musicians she claimed as her own. Her reputation as one of the most sought-after groupies fueled both admiration and jealousy. Model Baby Buell, another well-known figure from the era, later described Starr as one of the two most powerful groupies in Los Angeles, emphasizing that every rock star who came to Los Angeles wanted to meet her. Despite the glamorous and rebellious image that Starr projected, the reality of her lifestyle was far more complex and problematic. As an underage girl in a world dominated by powerful men, she was part of a scene where boundaries were often blurred and where young girls were both idolized and exploited. While many of the relationships she engaged in were seen as consensual at the time, in retrospect, they highlight the darker side of the rock industry, where famous musicians took advantage of their status and influence over impressionable young fans. The controversy surrounding Starr was not just about her relationships with musicians, but also about the broader culture of the 1970s rock scene, which frequently romanticized underage groupies without questioning the ethics behind these interactions. The same industry that celebrated young girls like Starr, Lori Maddox, and others also failed to protect them from the dangers of exploitation, emotional manipulation, and in some cases, abuse. At just 16 years old, Sable Starr made the impulsive decision to leave home and follow Johnny Thunders, the lead guitarist of the New York Dolls, to New York. To an outsider, this might have seemed like a natural progression for someone who had spent years deeply embedded in the Los Angeles rock scene. However, leaving behind her family and the familiar surroundings of the Sunset Strip marked a major turning point in her life, one that would expose her to an even darker side of the music world. Her relationship with Thunders, much like the man himself, was intense and unpredictable. Though she had spent her early teenage years among rock stars, this was the first time she was fully immersed in the world of punk rock, a scene that was even more raw, reckless, and self-destructive than the glam rock environment she had left behind. Initially, the move to New York seemed like an adventure. Thunders was a rising star. The New York Dolls were gaining notoriety, and she was now part of the punk movement's epicenter. However, the relationship quickly became toxic. Thunders, already battling severe heroin addiction, was deeply possessive and prone to erratic behavior. His jealousy led to frequent arguments, and as his drug use spiraled further out of control, their relationship became increasingly volatile. Unlike the flashy, drug-fueled excess of the Sunset Strip scene, where Starr had once been celebrated, the New York punk world was grittier, darker, and far more unforgiving. Thunder's addiction and paranoia created a toxic environment that Starr struggled to navigate. For the first time, the rock and roll fantasy she had chased from such a young age started to crumble. She had left Los Angeles searching for something bigger, but instead she found herself trapped in an unhealthy and destructive relationship. It wasn't long before the constant emotional turmoil became unbearable, and she ultimately made the difficult decision to leave Thunders and return to Los Angeles. During her time in New York, Starr was not only defined by her relationship with Thunders, she also became romantically involved with Richard Hell, one of the defining figures of the emerging punk scene. Hell, best known for his work with television, The Heartbreakers, which included Thunders, and the Voidoids, embodied the raw, rebellious spirit of punk rock. With his deliberately disheveled look, nihilistic attitude, and poetic lyricism, he was a major influence on the punk aesthetic that would later be popularized by bands like the Sex Pistols. Starr's involvement with Hell further solidified her place in the underground music world, connecting her to the most pivotal figures of punk's early years. It was also in New York that she befriended Nancy Spungen, a fellow groupie whose name would later become synonymous with Sid Vicious of the Sex Pistols. Spungen, like Starr, was a young woman deeply entangled in the music scene, known for her troubled past and self-destructive tendencies. The two formed a close bond, likely finding common ground in their experiences, navigating a world where teenage girls were often both idolized and discarded by the musicians they surrounded themselves with. This friendship placed Starr at the heart of a movement that was, at the time, still in its infancy, but would later explode into a worldwide cultural phenomenon. Though Starr's time in New York was brief, it was pivotal in her personal evolution. While she had once ruled over the Los Angeles glam rock groupie scene, her experiences in New York exposed her to the brutal realities of addiction, toxicity, and emotional instability in the music industry. Her relationship with Thunders, though passionate, was riddled with dysfunction, serving as one of her first true wake-up calls about the dangers of the world she had spent years glorifying. At the same time, her ties to Richard Hell and Nancy Spungen positioned her as a direct witness to the rise of punk rock, an entirely different movement from the one she had initially been part of. When she returned to Los Angeles, she was no longer the same wide-eyed teenage groupie who had once dominated the Sunset Strip. Though she had escaped the chaos of her relationship with Thunders, the experiences she had in New York, both thrilling and painful, would leave a lasting mark on her, pushing her one step closer to ultimately leaving the groupie lifestyle behind. After leaving behind the chaotic and often reckless lifestyle that had defined her youth, Sable Starr sought a sense of stability and normalcy, something she had never truly experienced during her years in the rock and roll scene. She moved to Nevada, settling in the small town of Minden, where she started working as a blackjack dealer at Carson Valley Inn. Unlike the glamour and excess of her teenage years spent among rock royalty, her new life was quiet, ordinary, and far removed from the world where she had once been a celebrated figure. This career shift, though a stark contrast to her past, provided her with a sense of routine and financial independence, something that had been absent in her younger years when she lived on the fringes of fame and fortune. During this time, Starr focused on her family life, embracing her role as a mother. She had 2 children, a son and a daughter, whom she raised away from the influence of the music industry. Despite her past notoriety, Starr chose to keep a low profile, rarely speaking publicly about her experiences as a groupie. Unlike some of her contemporaries who wrote books, gave interviews, or remained attached to the nostalgia of the 1970s rock scene, Starr deliberately distanced herself from that era. Whether this was out of regret, a desire for privacy, or simply a wish to move forward, she never attempted to reclaim the spotlight. Who knew Starr during this period described her as a quiet, private person. Her life in Minden was vastly different from the reckless freedom she had once embraced. She no longer chased excitement or fame. Her priorities had shifted completely. Having spent her youth as a symbol of rebellion, excess, and self-destruction, she now led a life focused on responsibility, stability, and family. In her final years, however, Starr faced one of the most challenging battles of her life. She was diagnosed with brain cancer, a devastating illness that she fought with strength and resilience. Though she had once thrived in a world fueled by indulgence and recklessness, this battle was something far beyond what she had encountered before. She continued to live in Nevada, away from the public eye, as she dealt with the disease. The former queen of the baby groupies, who had once dominated the Sunset Strip scene, now faced a far more personal and difficult struggle. On April 18, 2009, at the age of 51, Sable Starr passed away after her fight with brain cancer. Her death marked the end of a life that had seen both the heights of fame and the depths of disillusionment. Once a teenage girl who had captivated some of the most famous rock stars in the world, she had transformed into a woman who sought peace, privacy, and a life away from the chaos that had once defined her. Though she left behind 2 children, very little is known about her family life as she maintained her privacy until the very end. Her passing was not widely publicized, unlike the stories of many of the rock stars she had been involved with. Yet, despite stepping away from fame, she remains an enduring figure in rock history. Her name often mentioned in discussions about the groupie culture of the 1970s and its complex, often troubling legacy. Sable Starr's journey from a privileged yet rebellious teenager to a central figure in the rock and roll underground, and finally to a quiet, private woman in Nevada, was one of profound transformation. She experienced a world of excess and fame at an age when most girls were still figuring out their identities. But in the end, she chose a path that led her away from it all. Whether her final years were ones of peace or quiet reflection, only those closest to her would know. But what is certain is that she remains a lasting symbol of an era that was both glamorous and deeply flawed, a reminder of the blurred lines between youthful rebellion, exploitation, and the pursuit of identity in a world that often valued fame above all else.